He served for 37 years, led missions across 4 continents, earned 9 medals for valor. But one quiet sentence at a gas station turned Major General Elias Ward from a national hero into a public threat. Why? What was he really silenced for? This story will shake what you thought you knew about justice, power, and memory. Watch now, then like, share, and subscribe to help us bring hidden truths into the light. At exactly 5:38 in the evening, beneath the fading light of a late summer sky, Major General Elias Ward pulled into the quiet end of a gas station off County Road 17, just outside of Crescent Hill. His black sedan, spotless and deliberate, reflected the dimming glow of the sun like a steel memory. Ward, 64 years old, moved with a posture trained by decades of discipline. Spine tall, steps measured, eyes forward. His uniform was no longer military, but he still wore it in spirit. A pressed gray polo, clean slacks, polished shoes, and a gold watch gifted by the Secretary of Defense 10 years prior for exceptional service in high-risk international operations. That watch, still ticking without flaw, marked the beginning of what would become one of the most misinterpreted moments in recent memory. The station was nearly empty, save for a teenage attendant wiping the same smudge on the front window for the 3rd time, and a white SUV idling beside pump number 3. The driver of the SUV, later identified as 24-year-old Carson Bell, was shirtless, blaring music with bass that rattled the signage, and throwing crumpled fast food wrappers onto the pavement. He was live-streaming something, speaking into his phone with exaggerated gestures and bursts of laughter. Elias parked 2 pumps over, away from the chaos, preferring the quiet. He stepped out, scanned the area, and began fueling his car with the calm precision of someone who's studied silence longer than most people study speech. But silence, as always, would not be allowed to last. Carson Bell was pacing now, shirt half tucked into his shorts, drink in one hand, phone in the other. He flung open his rear passenger door to grab something from the floor. As he turned, he flailed the oversized drink and splattered half its contents onto Elias's passenger door and onto Elias himself. There was a beat of stillness, 1 breath, then 2. Elias didn't curse. He didn't raise his voice. He merely looked at Carson, eyes steady but not sharp. And then, in a voice as low and level as the sound of boots on parade ground, he said, "There's a difference between being free and being right." That was all. No insult, no anger, just a line. One simple line. But Carson, already aware of his camera's red light blinking live, took a step back, narrowed his eyes, and turned the moment into performance. "Yo, what did you just say to me?" he shouted, angling his phone so both their faces were visible. "This dude just threatened me, man. You hear that? You all hear that, right? He's trying to start something. I don't feel safe." And just like that, the story began to twist. Within 4 minutes, a call was made to local law enforcement. Carson claimed that an aggressive black man, mid-60s, possibly ex-military, just threatened to hurt him and was showing signs of mental instability. The dispatcher, unfamiliar with the actual Elias Ward, logged it in as a potential hostile veteran situation. Standard code in recent years, especially after several high-profile incidents involving soldiers with PTSD. The call transcript would later be reviewed and dissected 100 times over. But in the moment, it was simply enough to send 2 officers racing to the scene. Elias, meanwhile, remained standing beside his vehicle, wiping the spilled drink off his door with a napkin he'd kept in the glove box. He knew what was happening. Not exactly, but enough. He'd seen versions of it before. He didn't flee. He didn't speak again. He waited. When the officers arrived, lights flashing in the dimming dusk, the teenage attendant peeked from the window, but said nothing. Carson, animated and shaking slightly, for dramatic effect, approached the officers with his phone held out like a badge of honor. "He threatened me! Look, I got the beginning of it here. You can hear his tone, man. This guy's unhinged." The officers approached Elias with caution, hands resting near their weapons. "Sir, step away from the vehicle." Elias complied, slowly, silently. One officer asked for ID. Elias presented it. Military ID. The name Major General Elias L. Ward, Retifer, gleamed under the station lights. The second officer looked at the ID, paused, then said, "Sir, we've received a report of verbal aggression and perceived threat. We need to ask you a few questions." Elias replied, "I gave him a warning about respect. That was all." It wasn't enough. Carson continued narrating to his live audience. "They're taking him in. This is crazy. I just came here to get gas." The footage went viral within an hour. Clips circulated online, edited and captioned. "Angry veteran loses it on kid." "Retired general snaps in public," and "Military man threatens civilian at gas station." No one questioned the lack of actual threat. No one noticed the quiet way Elias was handcuffed, neither resisting nor reacting, only standing still as though attending one final roll call. By 8 o'clock, local news was running the story. By 10, a national headline flashed across screens. "Decorated veteran involved in public disturbance. Investigation underway." The footage from Carson's phone, blurred and shaky, was spliced with stock images of military combat zones, PTSD symptoms, and past cases of veterans snapping. Elias Ward's identity, accomplishments, and character were quietly left out. His medals weren't mentioned. His strategic contributions to international counterterrorism? Omitted. The thousands of troops who had served under him? Forgotten. All that remained was a manipulated moment and a public eager to consume outrage. What no one knew yet, what hadn't surfaced, was that the line Elias spoke wasn't random. It was a paraphrase of something he once told cadets at West Point during a commencement address. "Freedom without reflection leads to chaos. Being free is not the same as being right." That speech had earned a standing ovation and a handwritten note from the president. Now, those words were twisted into a supposed threat. The man who had led peacekeeping operations in 3 countries, who had diffused a nuclear standoff, who had spoken before the United Nations, was now trending under hashtags like Oradi Vet Gone Rogue and Hanao Sign Silent Threat. And still, Elias said nothing. He was booked, photographed, and held overnight pending evaluation. The officers filed their reports using Carson's version of events. No mention of spilled drink, no mention of silence, no nuance. But in the grainy footage that began to circulate, one that hadn't gone viral yet, a security camera across the street showed the entire interaction. No aggression, no shouting. Just a man standing beside his car, wiping liquid from his sleeve, speaking one sentence that made a boy with a camera feel judged. A sentence that would launch a national reckoning. The line between order and obedience had been drawn, and Elias Ward, decorated hero, had crossed it, not with force, not with rage, but with something far more dangerous to those who need control. Clarity. The footage surfaced just before 9 the next morning. A bystander, a teenager named Mia Alvarez, had uploaded a 10-second clip to her private story late the previous night. She hadn't meant to go viral. It was shaky, low resolution, filmed from inside her car as she filled her tank at the opposite end of the station. In the clip, Major General Elias Ward stood upright beside his car, hands visible, expression unreadable. Behind him, the flashing lights of 2 patrol cars cast a surreal glow across his shoulders. The clip caught one clear sentence, spoken in a voice that was measured and unmistakably calm. You have my identification. I'll comply. Then 2 officers moved in and placed handcuffs around his wrists. He didn't flinch. He didn't speak again. The clip was viewed 43,000 times in under 2 hours. But it wasn't that clip that shaped the public narrative. It was the one Carson Bell had posted, edited, dramatized, and fed through the adrenaline-hungry veins of social media. In his version, the footage began after the drink spill and cut directly to the moment Elias spoke his now infamous line. There's a difference between being free and being right. The camera angle obscured Carson's aggressive gestures, exaggerated Elias's size, and added captions that distorted the context. Man snaps at me for no reason. He looked dangerous. I was terrified. Within hours, the hashtags were trending. Unstable vet. Gas station threat. General gone wild. No one questioned how Carson knew to film before anything even happened. The next wave came from the media. Local news stations looped the footage on silent, overlaying graphics like public safety concerns and retired general in custody. By midday, the story had made its way to cable news, where anchors, lacking full information but full of opinion, began speculating. He was a high-ranking military official, said one anchor with a sympathetic frown. But we have to acknowledge the toll decades of warfare takes on the mind. PTSD is real. Could this be a case of untreated trauma boiling over in public? Another chimed in, We're not saying he's guilty of anything yet, but it's important to remember that many veterans struggle with reintegration. The system isn't doing enough, and unfortunately, the signs often appear too late. Not one anchor mentioned Elias's spotless mental health record, his role as a mentor in post-service rehabilitation programs, or his decades of mental fitness evaluations passed with distinction. None of them mentioned that he had written policy recommendations on veteran mental wellness himself. Instead, the story quickly morphed into something familiar but false. A narrative that painted Elias Ward not as a man of clarity and composure, but as a broken relic of war. By 4 o'clock that day, 3 news sites had published articles with similar headlines. Retired general displays erratic behavior in public altercation. Former military leader involved in gas station incident. PTSD suspected. Decorated but dangerous? The fine line between valor and volatility. Each piece quoted unnamed sources close to the investigation and referred vaguely to past behavioral concerns, though no evidence was ever presented. One network even pulled archived footage from an unrelated congressional hearing in which Elias had argued, with passion and authority, against military overreach. The clip was repurposed, his intensity reframed as instability. In less than 24 hours, Elias Ward had been transformed from a national symbol of composure into a cautionary tale. The system worked fast, not because it was efficient, but because it was afraid. That night, inside a dim holding room with flickering fluorescent lights, Elias sat in silence. His hands, free now from cuffs, rested neatly on the table in front of him. A single chair scraped against the floor as an officer entered and placed a paper cup of water down without a word. Elias didn't drink. He didn't ask for anything. He had trained soldiers under fire, commanded peace negotiations in cities under siege, and walked minefields for the sake of others. But in this room, his silence was mistaken for resistance. His calm was seen as concealment. His dignity was misread as threat. They asked if he needed a psychological evaluation. He responded, "Do what you believe is necessary." The evaluation was ordered. Elsewhere, in a polished downtown newsroom, a producer barked into her headset, "We've got him listed in 5 overseas deployments. Let's dig. Any disciplinary action, reprimands, anything minor we can reframe." An intern brought up an incident from 19 years earlier. Elias had refused to carry out a direct order to fire on a civilian structure during an insurgent sweep in Afghanistan. He had been cleared of wrongdoing and awarded the Bronze Star for courage and discretion. Now, the phrasing in the news script was tweaked. Sources confirm a history of challenging orders and potential issues with compliance. Another round of headlines followed. By midnight, public opinion was split down the center. One half called for investigation into how such a man could rise so high without being properly evaluated. The other half, mostly veterans and their families, filled forums with disbelief and rage. I served under him. He was the sharpest, calmest man in any room. Ward saved my brother's life. This whole thing stinks. They're doing to him what they did to every soldier who refused to look away. But the algorithms favored outrage, not nuance. And the institutions? They favored safety, of reputation, of order, of plausible deniability. Inside the Department of Defense, an internal memo was drafted, recommending neutral distance from all commentary regarding Major General Ward, pending further investigation. His awards page was temporarily disabled on the military website due to a technical issue. An anonymous staffer deleted Elias's keynote speech from the West Point archives. In one long breath, decades of valor disappeared from public view. And yet Elias remained unmoved. No protests, no press statements, no legal threats, only silence. He was not unfamiliar with betrayal. He had seen entire villages erased to protect lies. He had watched colleagues turn on their convictions to preserve rank. What was happening now was not new. It was simply faster. The smear campaign had a rhythm to it. Cast doubt, plant a whisper, rewrite the past just enough to confuse the present. But what they didn't realize, what they never expected, was that some truths live longer in silence than in speech. And this truth had only just begun to surface. Because while the headlines screamed chaos, one man, Captain Devin Rhodes, was sitting in his small apartment 2 towns away, rewatching the unedited footage from the body cam he wasn't supposed to copy. And in those frames, frame by frame, he began to see it. The lie, the silence, the cost. And he made a decision. The dismantling didn't happen all at once. It came in whispers, edits, missing links, quiet deletions that began to carve away at a man's life, one credential at a time. By the morning of the 3rd day after his arrest, something strange happened. Reporters trying to verify Major General Elias Ward's military history couldn't access his record on the Department of Defense's public service portal. A usually robust list, awards, campaign medals, leadership commendations, suddenly redirected to a blank page stamped with 5 words. This service file is restricted. To most of the public, it looked like a bureaucratic glitch. But to those who had served under him, who had sat beside him in classified briefings or received battlefield orders with his signature at the bottom, it was a red flag. You don't restrict Elias Ward's file unless you're trying to bury something. Within 24 hours, more digital footprints vanished. A speech he gave at West Point's graduation ceremony 11 years earlier, gone from the Academy's archives. A photo of him receiving the Distinguished Service Cross in Kandahar, flanked by 2 presidents and a Secretary of Defense, scrubbed from official galleries. Video of his testimony before a Senate Intelligence Committee, where he challenged unlawful renditions, unavailable due to copyright restrictions. That same video had been publicly accessible for nearly a decade. The erasure was systematic, surgical, purposeful. Behind the scenes, military public affairs offices were flooded with calls from journalists and veterans alike demanding clarity. A former defense correspondent, Lena Foster, posted on her feed, "I've interviewed Elias Ward 3 times. Always lucid, sharp, full of quiet power. Don't believe what they're spinning. Someone's rewriting a legacy in real time. But the machine kept turning. Calls made to Ward's former commanding officers were either unanswered or followed by canned replies. One colonel issued a vague statement. Major General Ward is undergoing a review process. It would be inappropriate to comment until that review is complete. Privately, he told his wife he was under pressure from the Inspector General's office to remain neutral for the sake of optics. Optics. That was the word they used now. Not justice, not truth. Even Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Cho, once one of Elias's most loyal deputies, was cornered. He had tried to speak to a local reporter, offering to confirm Ward's role in disarming a bomb cell outside Mosul that saved hundreds of lives. Hours later, Cho received a call from a Pentagon liaison reminding him that his upcoming promotion could be jeopardized by public speculation. He never gave the interview. The silence wasn't just deafening, it was strategic. And Elias? He said nothing. He sat in a holding cell for 48 hours, then was quietly transferred to a low-security federal facility for evaluation. Though no formal charges had been filed, he declined requests from journalists, activists, even former students who begged to hear his side. One reporter shouted through the glass as Elias was escorted into a courtroom for a preliminary review. "General Ward, do you have anything to say about the allegations?" He didn't look at her. He didn't look at anyone. But he wasn't hiding. He was waiting. Because he understood something most people had forgotten. When the system begins to erase you, every word you give them becomes another piece they can use to reshape your image. Silence wasn't surrender. It was armor. But while Elias remained quiet, others couldn't help but start noticing cracks in the official version of events. An independent military historian named Dr. Clarence Woodley noticed a strange discrepancy in the archived manifest of Operation Harrier, a black ops mission Elias had commanded 15 years prior. Previously available documentation credited Elias with saving both American and civilian lives in a high-stakes negotiation that prevented escalation between two neighboring nations. Now, the operation listed Joint Task Force Leadership, confidential. No mention of Ward. No summary of outcomes. Woodley posted a detailed thread, time-stamped and sourced, outlining how these removals were not only suspicious, they were illegal. Federal records of military recognition can't be altered post-retirement without formal declaration, he wrote. Where's the paper trail? Who signed off? No answers came. Meanwhile, Carson Bell, now treated like a minor celebrity, appeared on a podcast to discuss the incident with Elias. "He had that look, you know," he said. "Like cold. Like he'd snapped. I mean, who even talks like that? There's a difference between being free and being right." That's what he said. Who says stuff like that unless they're messed up? The host laughed. The audience laughed. But buried deep in the comments were voices pushing back. "You mean a general said something principled and you called it a threat? Y'all canceled a war hero because you don't know what dignity sounds like." The comment sections became battlegrounds. In the fog of accusation and revision, truth tried to breathe. In the meantime, Elias's longtime assistant, Julia Moore, quietly resigned from her consulting job with the Department of Homeland Security. She had worked with Elias for 11 years. She told no one why she left, only that she'd seen enough. That same day, she sent an encrypted email to 3 journalists. Attached were copies of internal memos, security access logs, and a single photograph. Elias Ward in full uniform, standing alone on a rain-soaked tarmac, the American flag at half-mast behind him. The date stamped at the bottom. March 4th, 2014, the day he had returned from a failed extraction mission in northern Syria, where he had carried the bodies of 2 fallen soldiers by hand, refusing to let anyone else bear the weight. That image had once gone viral. It had once been hailed as the face of American integrity. Now it was nowhere to be found, except in Julia's hands and in the memory of those who refused to forget. Because despite every effort to dismantle the legend, a deeper story was surfacing, one rooted not in error, but in erasure. One that asked a question more dangerous than any scandal. What system needs to destroy a man like Elias Ward to survive? That question was beginning to echo. Through deleted links, through locked records, through forced silences and erased photos, through the quiet refusal of a man who had spent 42 years learning when not to speak, so that when he finally did, the world would have no choice but to listen. And somewhere in a darkened office, lit only by the glow of a paused news clip, Captain Devin Rhodes stared at the frozen image of Elias being led away in cuffs. He didn't see instability. He saw intention, and that was when he knew the real war was just beginning. Captain Devin Rhodes sat alone in his dimly lit office at Fort Trenton, a mug of untouched black coffee slowly cooling beside a thick folder marked Restricted, Level 4 Clearance. It was 2:20 in the morning. The base had gone quiet. The night crew had retreated to their rotations, and the only sound in the room was the occasional soft creak of an aging HVAC unit above his head. But Devin didn't hear it. His mind was elsewhere, locked on the image that had stopped him cold 3 days ago. Major General Elias Ward, in handcuffs, silent, steady, and betrayed. To the world, Ward was now a footnote of suspicion, a headline, a faded hero whose past was being dismantled in real time. But to Devin, Elias Ward was something else. He was the reason Devin had stayed in the military after his first deployment. The reason he had learned to lead without raising his voice, to think 2 moves ahead, and to trust silence more than speeches. Ward didn't mold men through authority. He did it with presence. Devin remembered the first time he met him, 10 years ago during officer training in Quantico. Elias had spoken to a room of 400 young recruits and said only this: "There will be days when honor feels like a burden. Carry it anyway." That sentence had carried Devin through everything since. But now this? The media was painting Ward as unstable, delusional, dangerous. They questioned his mental state, distorted his past, even hinted at paranoia. And Devin, who knew the man better than most, couldn't sleep. Something didn't sit right. Not just because of who Ward was, but because of how quickly the system had turned on him. Too quickly. Like a plan already drawn. So Devin started digging. First, the public records. Most of them were either scrubbed, archived, or redirected. But Devin had higher clearance than the average reporter, and access to internal military archives through his security credentials. He pulled up Ward's service record, what was left of it. There were gaps where there shouldn't have been gaps, redactions on non-classified events, command citations replaced with vague Joint Operations Unit references. But one omission stood out: Operation Rain Chapel, Kandahar Province, 2011. Devin remembered that mission. It had been whispered about among junior officers as a case study in ethical restraint. Ward had reportedly refused to carry out a retaliatory strike when intel showed a Taliban informant was sheltering inside a civilian compound. The mission was logged as indeterminate outcome. But that wasn't the story Devin had heard. He reached out to an old colleague, Lieutenant Eric Kwan, now posted at an intelligence wing in Germany. Kwan, after a moment of hesitation, agreed to send a redacted mission summary through a secure line. It arrived 3 hours later. Devin scanned the document carefully. Ward had filed an official protest after the mission, noting gross disregard for non-combatant life and implicating 2 superior officers in unauthorized field-level orders to bypass engagement protocols. The report had been buried under pending review. There was no follow-up. This was the first crack. Then came Operation Drift Signal, a black site rotation in Djibouti, 2013. Ward was stationed nearby but not officially assigned. Yet Devon found Ward's signature on a requisition form for medical supplies issued to the site. And then, 12 days later, a formal ethics complaint filed by Ward against Commandant R.J. Herrick, citing detainment of civilians in conditions violating Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions. That report, too, was closed, with no action taken. Herrick, as Devon noted bitterly, now chaired the Joint Oversight Subcommittee on Military Justice. 2 whistleblower actions, both buried, both followed by invisible erasures. It wasn't coincidence anymore. This wasn't a fall from grace. It was punishment. And as the patterns emerged, Devon began to notice the shape of something larger, something patient and methodical. Every time Ward had spoken against the machinery, that machinery had made sure to reposition him quietly, away from visibility, away from influence. He was promoted, yes, but always laterally, always into positions with more title than teeth. It was praise as misdirection. And now, the final blow, public humiliation. The gas station incident, absurd in its setup, tragic in its intent, wasn't just an overreaction. It was a trigger, an opportunity, a stage. By 4:45 that morning, Devon had compiled a working dossier. He didn't know how deep the cover-up ran, but he knew enough to be certain. Elias Ward was being silenced for what he refused to ignore. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes, feeling the weight of clarity settle like lead across his shoulders. What made it worse, what made it burn, was the knowledge that men like Herrick and others at the top were counting on silence. They were counting on the rest of the military, especially younger black officers like Devon, to stay in line, to protect the institution over the truth. But Elias hadn't taught him that. He opened his encrypted cloud storage and began uploading the documents. Then he opened a secure channel and drafted an anonymous memo to an independent watchdog group with ties to military justice reform. He didn't sign it. He didn't need to. The truth didn't need his name yet. But then, as the sun began to rise over Fort Trenton, casting a dull orange glow across the concrete courtyard, Devon opened a blank document and began typing again, this time with a name. Subject line, Elias Ward, suppressed reports and operational retaliation. For immediate review. He attached every file, every timestamp, every buried complaint. And at the bottom, he wrote a single line. There will be days when honor feels like a burden. I choose to carry it anyway. Then he hit send. The machine had counted on loyalty. It had counted on fear. But it hadn't counted on the quiet legacy Elias Ward had left behind. It hadn't counted on men like Devon Rhodes. Kendra Miles wasn't supposed to be looking at that file. She wasn't even supposed to be inside the archive room that day. Certainly not after hours. Certainly not without clearance. But that had never stopped her before. After 16 years in investigative journalism, she'd learned something the hard way. The closer you get to the truth, the more forbidden the door feels. So, when a retired analyst from the Office of Special Defense handed her an unmarked flash drive over a half-finished espresso at a diner in Alexandria and said, "I think this belonged to someone who knew what silence costs," she knew better than to ignore it. The file was buried in a series of nested folders under a false project name, Stormvest Agro Logistics, a meaningless title masking what would soon become the most damning evidence she had ever handled. Inside was a single document, 6 pages long, redacted in parts, but unmistakably authored by Major General Elias Ward. Its heading read, After Action Summary. Operation Mistral Echo, Northern Mali, July 2014. Kendra had never heard of it. No public record. No reference in Ward's known deployments. But the tone of the report, the precision of the language, and most importantly, the implications, made it clear. This wasn't an ordinary mission, and it hadn't gone as planned. The summary recounted a covert joint task operation conducted near the Niger-Mali border. Officially, the objective was to dismantle a weapons cache operated by extremist militants. Ward's team had been brought in for strategic oversight, with tactical execution assigned to a contracted international strike group working under the Department of Defense's Civil-Military Engagement Program. But what the report detailed next pulled Kendra to the edge of her chair. Ward's team, using aerial recon and intel provided by local NGOs, had confirmed the presence of 42 unarmed civilians inside the compound just hours before the scheduled assault. Ward immediately issued a halt order. He advised delaying the strike until a civilian-safe corridor could be established. The order was overridden within 19 minutes. The airstrike proceeded. 37 civilians were confirmed dead, 12 of them children. Ward documented the breach in protocol meticulously. He included timestamps, intercepted communications, and statements from team members on the ground. The final paragraph of the report stated plainly, "This decision, taken in direct contradiction to engagement rules, constitutes a willful disregard for the lives of non-combatants. It undermines the core values of this command and violates the Geneva Conventions as interpreted by NATO partners. I submit this report with an urgent request for internal review and disciplinary action." At the bottom, Elias Ward's signature. Dated July 26, 2014. The final page, one Kendra nearly missed, was a classified appendix. Its contents stunned her. 2 high-level defense advisors had been copied on the override authorization. Their names were both familiar. Too familiar. Assistant Secretary Darren Kell, Undersecretary Nolan Herrick. Both men were now leading the internal inquiry into Ward's recent conduct. Both had appeared on major networks in the past week, defending the investigation, citing concerns regarding General Ward's judgment, stability, and past behavior. Herrick, in particular, had been outspoken, declaring Ward's career a troubling example of unchecked authority hiding beneath military prestige. Now Kendra understood why they were speaking so loudly, because they had everything to lose if Ward's voice was ever heard again. Her stomach tightened. She pushed away from the desk, file still open on the screen, and reached for her recorder. Her hands trembled as she pressed record. July 22nd, 2:56 a.m. This is Kendra Miles. I have just confirmed the existence of a sealed report from Operation Mistral Echo, authored by Major General Elias Ward. The report details civilian deaths during a covert strike and directly implicates 2 sitting defense officials. This is the clearest motive yet for the coordinated smear campaign against him. She stopped the recording and backed everything up twice. Once to a secure cloud server, once to a separate encrypted drive she kept duct-taped under the dashboard of her car. It was the first thing she learned in this job. Trust your gut, and trust 2 copies more. As the sun began to rise over the Potomac, Kendra stood at her window, still holding the drive. Across town, headlines were still regurgitating the narrative of the unbalanced veteran. Talk shows continued debating the mental decline of Elias Ward, with hand-picked experts offering textbook breakdowns of trauma, paranoia, and delusion. But none of them knew what she now held in her hands. Not paranoia, but pattern. Not delusion, but documentation. Not instability, but a cover-up. She didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. Instead, she spent the next 8 hours confirming the contents of the file. cross-referencing military orders, confirming satellite data, tracking deployment rosters. And then she reached out to a source she'd avoided for years. Colonel Alma Dubois, former legal advisor for U.S. Forces Africa, now retired and working quietly as a legal consultant. Dubois confirmed everything. "I warned him," she said over a scratchy signal from a remote cabin. "I told Elias that filing that report would make him enemies powerful enough to rewrite his past." He said, "Then let them try. My past is the one thing they don't own." Kendra's voice was hoarse when she asked, "Why now? Why the gas station? Why this sudden takedown?" Dubois didn't hesitate. "Because the world forgot who he was, and they thought no one would look twice." Kendra stared at the drive in her hand. Well, she was looking, and she wasn't blinking. By midnight that day, she had prepared the article. Not just a breaking report, but a full exposé. She traced the line from Mali to the Pentagon, from Ward's buried report to the talking points spouted on primetime news. She quoted his exact words. She included the names. She titled the piece simply, "The Last Operation." The subhead, "What Elias Ward Tried to Stop, and Why They're Trying to Erase Him for It." She hit publish. The story went live at 1:13 a.m. It spread faster than anyone anticipated. Veterans forums exploded. Human rights organizations reposted it within minutes. A trending hashtag emerged. "Sucks, Ward was right." And somewhere, in a federal detention facility just outside Baltimore, Elias Ward was sitting on the edge of his cot, facing the concrete wall, his posture straight, his silence steady, exactly as he had been when they arrested him. He didn't know that Kendra's story had just set the internet on fire. He didn't know that people were beginning to remember. But he didn't need to. He had written the truth a long time ago. All it needed was someone brave enough to open the file. The hearing room was designed for order. Polished mahogany desks, state flags standing in symmetrical lines, nameplates shining under stage lighting, microphones adjusted to capture only what was meant to be heard. But on this day, at exactly 10:37 in the morning, it became something else entirely. It became a place of reckoning. The public inquiry into Operation Mestral Echo had been scheduled in response to journalist Kendra Miles's explosive exposé. In just 48 hours, her article had reached over 9 million views. Her reporting didn't merely rattle windows, it blew the doors off a truth long buried, that Major General Elias Ward had tried to stop a war crime and been erased for it. A new round of hearings was convened. Subpoenas were issued. Testimonies lined up like dominoes ready to fall. And then a name appeared on the witness list that no one expected. Admiral Jonah Carr, 69 years old. Retired Navy legend. Decorated 4-star admiral and former chief of naval operations. Known for his strategic brilliance and for his cold public clashes with Elias Ward during their overlapping tenures. He had once called Ward a walking contradiction, too quiet to command and too bold to obey. The two had stood on opposite ends of nearly every tactical debate in the early 2010s. For years, Carr had been considered Ward's ideological foil, so when he strode into the hearing room wearing his full-dress blues, the entire chamber tensed. Cameras adjusted, reporters whispered. The chairman glanced down at his notes, uncertain whether this was a stunt or a real testimony. But Carr's face told the story before his voice did. He looked different, not polished, not defiant, just resolute and tired. The kind of tired that only men who've lived inside secrets know. He took his seat slowly, then removed the cap from his head and placed it on the desk. His right hand trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone. And then he began. "My name is Admiral Jonah Carr, retired, serial number 5870, former Chief of Naval Operations and proud servant of the United States Navy. He paused. I appear today not as a representative of any institution, but as a man who has watched too many lies become protocol. And I'm here to speak about Major General Elias Ward. The room went still. Even the camera operators froze. I have known Elias for 30 years. We met in Kandahar, worked side by side during operations in East Africa, and sat across from one another during more Pentagon briefings than I care to remember. We disagreed, often loudly. But I never doubted his integrity. I doubted his politics, his methods, his damn obsession with moral clarity. But I never, not once, doubted his honor. He reached for a glass of water, took a slow sip, then continued. In 2014, during Operation Mistral Echo, Elias filed a classified report that accused 2 senior officials of bypassing engagement protocols, leading to civilian deaths. I saw that report. I saw the evidence. And I watched it get buried. Not because it was false, but because it was too true. Gasps rippled through the room. Carr didn't flinch. We were told it was necessary, that the narrative had to be clean, that the operation was too politically sensitive to allow room for nuance. Elias pushed back. He wouldn't stay quiet. And so they made a decision. Either erase the report or erase the man. He looked directly at the senators in front of him. They chose both. At that moment, the air changed. As if someone had broken a seal and let truth in like cold wind. Carr leaned forward. I knew what was happening. I didn't stop it. I told myself I had bigger battles to fight. I told myself Elias could handle it, that he'd survive the smear campaign, that history would be kind. He lowered his head. But I was wrong, and I was a coward. Silence. Then Carr's voice sharpened, like a blade pulled from its sheath. This government talks about patriotism, about sacrifice, about honoring the men and women who serve. But what happened to Elias Ward is not just a betrayal of him. It's a betrayal of every soldier who ever believed their integrity mattered more than politics. He gestured to the room. Look around. Do you know how many careers Elias saved? Not just lives, careers. Officers who were going to be court-martialed for reckless decisions, miscalculations, or failures of courage. Elias stood between them and ruin. He absorbed blame that wasn't his. He carried reputations on his back. And this is how we repay him? By branding him unstable? Because he refused to watch civilians die? He let that question hang. No one dared answer. Then Carr reached into the inside pocket of his uniform jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it up, hand steady now. This is the recommendation letter Elias wrote for my son when he applied to the Naval Academy. My son was nearly disqualified for disciplinary issues, drinking, fighting, anger. Elias didn't ignore it. He addressed it directly. He wrote, "Character is not about perfection. It's about what a man does after his worst mistake." Carr's voice cracked. My son is now a lieutenant commander, because Elias Ward believed in redemption, even when no one else did. He turned toward the gallery where cameras blinked red, recording every word. I may have disagreed with Elias, but today I'm doing what I should have done years ago. He stood, and then, in full view of the nation, Admiral Jonah Carr removed the medals from his jacket and placed them face down on the table. I will not wear these again until Elias Ward's name is restored. Reporters burst into motion. Cameras zoomed. The chairwoman called for order. But there was no containing it. Within minutes, Carr's testimony was clipped, shared, streamed, translated. His words echoed through newsrooms and veterans' halls. I didn't doubt his honor. I doubted my own. The narrative cracked, and behind it, the truth began to shine. Elias Ward, who had been branded dangerous, unhinged, unstable, was now, again, something closer to what he had always been. A man who told the truth before it was safe. And somewhere, watching from a small monitor inside the detention center, Elias Ward sat in silence. But for the first time since his arrest, the corner of his mouth lifted. Not a smile. Not yet. But something close. Something earned. Because Admiral Carr had done what no one else had dared. He made the system speak its own shame. The courthouse was built to impress. High ceilings, marble floors, thick wood paneling that swallowed sound and emotion alike. It was the kind of place where justice wore a mask of permanence, where silence was usually treated as guilt and dignity mistaken for defiance. But on that morning, at exactly 9:03, when Major General Elias Ward was escorted into Courtroom 7B in iron-gray slacks and a plain white shirt, hands unshackled but presence unyielding, the space took on a different weight. One not designed by architects, but by history itself. The charge against him was as thin as it was calculated. Disorderly conduct. A vague accusation wrapped in the illusion of law meant not to punish a crime, but to justify containment. The prosecution's motion for a mandatory psychiatric evaluation had already been granted in pre-trial. No cross-examination allowed. They claimed aberrant behavior at the gas station, citing unusual silence, philosophical speech, and apparent failure to comply with emotional norms. Translation: Elias Ward hadn't flinched, hadn't panicked, hadn't raised his voice. And that, somehow, made him dangerous. He stood at the defense table now, straight-backed, eyes forward. He hadn't spoken publicly since his arrest. He hadn't granted interviews. No statements, no social media posts, not even a glance at the cameras in the gallery. Just silence. The kind that wrapped itself around the room and made everyone else unsure of their place in it. To the prosecution, this was an opportunity, a blank canvas onto which they could paint anything. They painted a man of prestige turned unpredictable, a once-honored general detached from reality, a soldier who had carried his trauma too far into peacetime. They presented a heavily cropped version of the gas station footage, muted and contextless, played in slow motion to make Ward's stillness look eerie instead of controlled. They described the words he spoke. There's a difference between being free and being right, as existential and out of touch. Is this, the prosecutor asked the court, the language of a stable man? The judge, Harold Whitmore, said nothing. His face remained unreadable, a careful neutrality honed over 31 years on the bench. But he tapped his gavel once, just once, when a woman in the gallery stifled a scoff. It was Kendra Miles. She was seated next to Captain Devin Rhodes, both of them locked in stillness of their own. Between them sat a black folder thick with paper, digital drives, and two items that would change the course of the trial. The uncut body cam footage from Officer Green and a set of declassified internal documents that traced the quiet, bureaucratic erasure of Elias Ward's career. When the prosecution rested its case, Devin stood. He walked to the witness stand in full-dress uniform, his bars polished, his boots shining, the tension in his jaw held like a salute. He took the oath, placed a hand on the folder, and faced the jury. My name is Captain Devin Rhodes. I am a commissioned officer in the United States Army, trained under Major General Elias Ward, and I am here today because I believe this court has been misled. The judge raised an eyebrow. The prosecutor objected, claiming prejudice. The judge overruled it. For the first time, a crack formed. Devin clicked open the folder and began distributing copies of the documents. A paralegal rushed to provide the jury with screens. On the monitors, the body cam footage began to play. This time, no cuts, no filters, just reality. The entire room watched. Ward, standing by his car, napkin in hand. Carson Bell, shirtless, shouting, circling, posturing. The spilled drink, the calm voice, the now famous line, the handover of ID, the calm compliance, the clean interaction. When the footage ended, the silence in the courtroom was no longer heavy with suspicion. It was thick with shame. Devon didn't stop there. He moved to the second document, a sequence of internal memos and deployment logs tracing Ward's reassignments after each whistleblower report. He connected dates. He showed locations. He included the buried report from Operation Mistral Echo and the override orders signed by Herrick and Kell. They erased his medals. They redacted his missions. They distorted his silence. And now they want you to believe he's unstable, because they know what he remembers. Then Kendra rose. She was calm, composed, every word sharp as steel. This case isn't about disorderly conduct. It's about erasing a witness. General Ward didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't resist. He simply refused to lie. And that's what made him a threat. She turned to the jury. I've spent my life chasing stories buried under red tape. But I've never seen a burial this methodical, this coordinated, or this afraid. The prosecutor attempted damage control. They pivoted to emotional instability, cited vague evaluations. But it was too late. The courtroom had shifted. The jurors no longer looked at Ward as a suspect. They looked at him as a man under siege. Judge Whitmore called for a recess. Elias didn't speak, still. But as he stood, turning toward the door, his eyes caught Devon's for the first time. And for the first time since the trial began, he nodded. A quiet recognition. A passing of something unspoken between soldiers. Outside the courthouse, reporters scrambled to update their headlines. Footage contradicts initial charges. Captain testifies in defense of General Ward. New evidence raises questions about prosecution motives. The public, once unsure, now began to swing. Veterans groups released statements of support. Human rights advocates called for a federal inquiry. Hashtags like Chaff Justice Forward and Chaffrey's silence is not unstable began trending again. Inside the judge's chambers, the temperature had changed, and in the prosecutor's office, the scramble turned to panic. Because what had begun as a show trial designed to neutralize a threat was becoming something far more dangerous to those in power. A stage for truth. By the morning after Captain Devon Rhodes and journalist Kendra Miles revealed the full, unedited truth in Courtroom 7B, something had shifted, not just in the legal proceedings, but in the bloodstream of the nation. What began as a whispered question in activist forums and veterans networks now burned across every screen, every scroll, every broadcast. 3 words, etched like defiance into timelines and comment sections, trended in synchronized rhythm from coast to coast. Ward was right. At 6:42 a.m., it was a single tweet from a retired Marine in Topeka, Kansas. I served under that man. He never raised his voice, but when he looked at you, you stood straighter. Ward was right. Justice Forward. By 8:15, it had been shared over 40,000 times. By noon, it became the top trending hashtag in the country. Chan Ward was right, outpacing celebrity news, sports finals, and a sitting senator's re-election campaign scandal. America was watching, but not just from behind screens. In Boston, members of a local VFW post gathered in uniform outside the courthouse holding laminated photographs of Elias Ward from his Kandahar deployment. Their banner read, "One man told the truth." The system called it disorder. In Atlanta, veterans of color organized a roundtable streamed live on social media, where former soldiers recounted how whistleblowers had been marginalized, discredited, or pushed into retirement with veiled threats. "Ward is us," one said. "Only difference is the world caught this one on camera." In Chicago, human rights groups marched to the steps of the federal building, carrying enlarged versions of the classified report from Operation Mistral Echo, now publicly available thanks to Kendra's article. Protesters held signs that asked simple, devastating questions. Why was the truth buried? And who profits from silence? Cable news networks, once spinning the narrative of the unstable general, shifted overnight. Ward's legacy became breaking news. His photo, once used as a cautionary image, was now reintroduced with reverence. Clips of his past speeches were aired, his voice, measured, deliberate, quoted in white text over black backgrounds. Silence is not surrender. Sometimes, it's the only thing they can't edit. On one station, a conservative anchor made a rare admission on live air. "We were wrong. We followed the noise, not the evidence. Ward didn't crack. He endured. And now, it's time we do the same." That evening, a candlelight vigil was held outside the detention center, where Elias was still being held pending judicial review. Hundreds showed up. Veterans, students, parents, strangers. Some brought folded flags. Others brought candles, photos, handwritten notes. And though Ward couldn't see them, he knew. He always knew. At the Pentagon, the mood was less reverent, more frayed. Internal emails leaked to independent outlets revealed chaos behind closed doors. Policy advisors demanded damage control strategies. Public affairs teams scrambled to answer questions from military families. Several low-level aides reported external interference in the deletion of Ward's records, and for the first time in decades, a phrase returned to the halls of military bureaucracy like a distant drumbeat. National inquiry. It began as a bipartisan call in Congress, led by Senator Myra Dalton, a former JAG attorney and lifelong advocate for military transparency. Standing at the Senate podium, her voice sharp and steady, she announced the formation of a special investigative committee. "We will investigate the manipulation of military records. We will investigate the retaliatory mechanisms used to silence whistleblowers. We will investigate the targeting of Major General Elias Ward. And we will, finally, confront the culture that punished a soldier not for failure, but for moral clarity." Her words were met with a standing ovation. The committee was granted subpoena power. Hearings were scheduled. Testimonies lined up. The first witnesses were not politicians or officers, but civilians who had lost family members in the very operation Ward tried to prevent. One mother held up the picture of her daughter, age 11, killed in the Mali airstrike. "This man, Elias Ward, was the only one who told the truth," she said. "And they called him unstable?" Meanwhile, at universities across the country, students organized panels titled "The Price of Silence" and "Truth in Uniform." Professors added Ward's case to ethics syllabi. Law schools dissected the systemic legal manipulation used against him. In libraries, his speeches were downloaded and printed. In classrooms, he became a case study in institutional betrayal. On social media, the Ward Was Right movement evolved. Artists posted digital murals. Animators recreated key courtroom moments. Veterans filmed short testimonies, ending each one with the same words. He didn't raise his voice. He raised the standard. Even those who had once stayed silent were now stepping forward. Colonel Renata Graves, who had previously declined media contact, released a public letter. In it, she admitted she had known about Ward's whistleblower reports and had chosen self-preservation over truth. "Every day, I regret it," she wrote. "But the least I can do now is help uncover what was done to the man who helped uncover so much." The pressure became inescapable. The Department of Defense issued a statement saying it would cooperate with the inquiry to ensure the integrity of our institutions. But by then, the public didn't want promises. They wanted names. They wanted accountability. And in the midst of it all, Elias Ward remained silent, still inside the facility, still watching from behind reinforced glass, still waiting. When a staff member brought in a newspaper and left it on his cot, he didn't pick it up right away. He let it sit. Only after the lights dimmed, when the facility fell into its ritual hush, did he reach for it. There on the front page was a photo of Admiral Jonah Carr, standing in the hearing room, eyes fierce, medals removed. Below it, 3 words in bold. Ward was right. Elias stared at it for a long moment, then folded the paper, then looked at the door. Not because he needed to leave, but because now America had finally entered the room. The crowd had begun gathering hours before dawn. Veterans in faded uniforms, journalists with notepads clenched in wind-bitten fingers, college students wrapped in scarves stamped with the now iconic phrase, "Ward was right." Mothers and fathers who had lost children in silent wars, survivors of missions buried under decades of redacted reports. Even a few faces from Capitol Hill, their presence careful and quiet, mingling in the crowd instead of claiming the stage. It was the dedication of the National Memorial for Conscience in Service, a place envisioned not for the loudest heroes, but for the quietest ones. It stood at the base of a low hill in Arlington, shadowed by the larger monuments, yet carved with a different kind of reverence. Not rows of names, but single sentences, fragments of truth spoken or endured by those who had risked everything for integrity. And on this day, under a sky veined with soft morning gold, the final etching was to be revealed. But the man whose name it honored sat not on the stage, not at the microphone, not behind the velvet ropes reserved for honored guests. He sat 4 rows back, in a simple dark coat, his hands folded neatly on his lap, his eyes behind sunglasses no camera could penetrate. Major General Elias Ward, 64 years old, still tall, still silent. The world now knew what they had done to him, the lies they wrote, the truths they buried, the medals they stripped from digital pages, then had to return with shaking hands. The charges had been dropped, the detention vacated. The apology, if it could be called that, issued by a department too nervous to face its own reflection. A national inquiry had confirmed what the world now suspected. The erasure of Elias Ward had not been accidental. It had been a coordinated act of self-preservation by those whose power trembled at the sound of moral clarity. And yet Ward refused the podium. He had been invited to speak. They had begged, in fact, senators, activists, broadcasters. They had offered a speechwriter, security, even a standing ovation before a single word was uttered. He declined every offer with a polite nod, not out of bitterness, not from fear, but because he understood something most of them still didn't. He didn't need to say anything. He had already said what mattered. In court, in reports no one read until they were unsealed, in moments at a gas station where most men would have exploded, but he had simply stood still and told the truth. There's a difference between being free and being right. That sentence had started a national reckoning. It didn't need to become a speech. The MC's voice echoed across the stone as the covering was slowly pulled away from the granite wall. Cameras clicked. Drone footage hovered in quiet arcs above the field. But everyone, every last person, was looking not at the wall, but at the man sitting among them. The stone was smooth, jet black, polished to a mirror-like sheen, and at its center, newly etched in silver script, truth never needed to shout, only to endure. There was no name beneath it, but no one needed a name. Somewhere, a child asked, "Is that him?" And his mother whispered, "Yes, baby. That's the one who told the truth." And the child stared, not at the monument, but at the back of Elias Ward's head, watching how still he sat. News anchors reported in hushed tones. Former critics, once so quick to question his mental stability, now quoted his silence with reverence. Profiles ran in every major paper, most using titles like "The Man Who Didn't Speak" or "General of Stillness." The most shared image of the day was not the wall, nor the crowd, nor the monument itself, but a photo of Elias in that fourth row, one hand resting over the other, a small book tucked into his coat pocket, unread. He gave no interviews. He signed no books. When a young soldier approached afterward to thank him, Elias simply placed a hand on the man's shoulder and nodded. Once, deeply, as if to pass something wordless between them. In the weeks that followed, something remarkable happened. Schools began including his story in textbooks, not as a warning, but as a case study in ethical courage. Congressional hearings referenced the Ward precedent, a new proposed policy to protect military whistleblowers from retaliation. A scholarship was named after him, designed for students pursuing studies in military ethics, international law, and public accountability. Still, Elias said nothing. He lived quietly in a modest residence on the edge of Maryland, not far from a lake where he often walked at dawn. Sometimes he was seen with a notebook, sometimes with a dog he had adopted from a shelter under someone else's name. He kept no social media. He answered letters rarely, and only in his own handwriting, deliberate, unhurried, like a man who knew each word carried a weight nothing digital could replicate. And though he never claimed the spotlight, the world kept returning to his silence. Because it had meant something. Because it had endured. One night, nearly 6 months after the memorial was unveiled, a national news anchor ended her broadcast with a rare moment of stillness. No graphics, no music, just a single image on the screen. Elias Ward, standing alone, his reflection caught in the polished black stone. She said nothing for 10 seconds. Then she whispered, "We used to think silence was weakness. He taught us otherwise." The feed faded to black, and across the country, in living rooms and late-night screens, a generation sat with that image. Not loud, not viral, just still. Because the story of Elias Ward wasn't just about a trial, or a report, or a cover-up. It was about the strength to endure when everything designed to silence you becomes louder than truth itself. And how sometimes the loudest thing a man can do is not speak at all. What happened to Major General Elias Ward wasn't just the takedown of a man. It was a mirror held up to the soul of a nation. For American citizens, his story is more than a cautionary tale. It's a call to wake up. We live in a country where 37 years of decorated service, 9 medals, and 4 continents of honor can be rewritten in 24 hours by a headline and a camera phone. A man who saved lives in war zones was nearly erased not by enemies abroad, but by silence at home. What does that say about the systems we've built? And more importantly, what does that say about us? Ward's story shows us that truth doesn't always come roaring through microphones. Sometimes it walks softly. It stands still. It refuses to be baited or broken. And when we look away from that kind of truth, we become complicit in its burial. His quiet resistance, his refusal to fight with noise, revealed something uncomfortable. That institutions will twist dignity into disorder if it threatens their narrative. But here's the deeper lesson. For every citizen watching, you are not powerless. One uncut video, one article, one voice willing to break the pattern. That's all it took to reverse a storm of lies. That's all it ever takes. If we want accountability, we must demand it. If we want to protect those who protect the truth, we must be louder than their erasers. Remember this, it wasn't a courtroom that saved Elias Ward. It was the people who watched, who questioned, who said, "Not this time." That's the power of memory, of attention, of you. So don't scroll past this. Don't treat this story like yesterday's news. This is your country. This is your reflection. Like this video, share it with 5 people who still believe silence is weakness. Subscribe to the channel so we can keep uncovering stories they'd rather keep buried. Because justice doesn't trend. It takes root, and it grows in the hearts of those who refuse to forget. Let Elias Ward's story be more than a headline. Let it be the moment you realized that endurance, quiet, steady, unshakable, is the most powerful form of resistance in America today. Truth never needed to shout, but it does need to be heard.